What would you do if someone shot you 12 times at point-blank range and left you for dead in the middle of nowhere? Most men would die. Most men would never get the chance to even think about revenge. But Tom Horn wasn't most men. On a freezing November night in 1873, in a dusty saloon on the outskirts of Dodge City, Kansas, Tom Horn walked through those swinging doors not knowing he was about to experience something that would defy every law of nature and human survival. He was just a 32-year-old ranch hand, minding his own business, looking for a hot meal and maybe a whiskey to warm his bones after 3 weeks on the cattle trail. He had money in his pocket, honest money earned through hard work and sweat under the unforgiving prairie sun. But there were men in that saloon who didn't care about honest money. There were men who saw opportunity in a lone cowboy far from home. And there was one man in particular, a man named Clayton Briggs, who would make the biggest mistake of his miserable life that night. Now, before we get into what happened in that saloon, before we talk about those 12 bullets and how Tom Horn survived what no man should survive, you need to understand who Clayton Briggs was. This wasn't just some random outlaw looking to rob a cowboy. Clayton Briggs was known throughout Kansas and Colorado territories as one of the most ruthless criminals west of the Mississippi. He had 11 confirmed kills to his name, though people whispered the real number was closer to 30. He ran with a gang of 6 men, all of them wanted in at least 3 territories, and together they'd robbed banks, stagecoaches, and lone travelers for the better part of 5 years. But Briggs had something that made him particularly dangerous, something beyond just his willingness to kill. He was smart. Calculated. He never left witnesses. Never left anyone alive to identify him or his gang. Every robbery, every crime scene, ended the same way with a bullet to the head of anyone who'd seen their faces. And on that November night, when Tom Horn walked into that saloon wearing his best coat with 3 months' wages in his inside pocket, Clayton Briggs saw an opportunity too good to pass up. The saloon was called the Rusty Nail, and it was the kind of establishment where questions weren't asked and strangers weren't particularly welcome but weren't turned away either as long as they had money for drinks. Tom walked up to the bar, his spurs jingling with each step, and ordered a whiskey and whatever food the kitchen had ready. The bartender, a thick-necked man with a scar running from his left eye to his jawline, poured the drink without a word and disappeared into the back. Tom stood there at the bar, alone with his thoughts, not noticing the 6 pairs of eyes watching him from a corner table. Not seeing Clayton Briggs lean over and whisper something to his men. Not catching the subtle nods and the way hands moved slowly toward gun belts. Tom Horn had been a cowboy his entire adult life, had driven cattle from Texas to Kansas more times than he could count, but he wasn't a gunfighter. Wasn't a violent man. He'd never killed anyone, never even drawn his weapon against another human being. And that inexperience, that fundamental decency, was about to cost him everything. When the bartender returned with a plate of beans and cornbread, Tom thanked him and asked if there was a room available for the night. He was tired, bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that settles into your muscles after weeks in the saddle. The bartender jerked his thumb toward a staircase in the corner and quoted a price. Tom reached into his inside pocket to pull out his money, and that simple gesture sealed his fate. Because Clayton Briggs saw that bulging pocket, saw the thick roll of bills, and made his decision in that instant. The gang stood as one, moving with the practiced coordination of men who'd done this before, many times before. Tom was still counting out coins for the room when he felt the cold press of a gun barrel against his spine. He froze, his hand halfway to his pocket, as Clayton Briggs's whiskey-soaked breath washed over his ear. "Don't move, cowboy," Briggs whispered. "Don't even breathe hard. You're gonna hand over that money real slow, and maybe you'll walk out of here alive." The other patrons in the saloon suddenly found their drinks fascinating. The bartender vanished into the back room. This was frontier justice, or rather, frontier injustice, and nobody was going to risk their neck for a stranger. Tom's mind raced. He'd heard stories about Clayton Briggs, everyone had, and he knew what happened to people who cooperated with the Briggs gang. They died anyway. Every single one of them. But what choice did he have? 6 armed men surrounded him, all with their hands on their guns, all with that dead-eyed look that said they'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. So Tom did the only thing he thought might save his life. He complied. "All right," Tom said slowly, his voice steady despite the fear pumping through his veins. "You can have the money. No need for anyone to get hurt." He reached into his pocket carefully, pulled out the roll of bills, and held it up. 3 months' wages. Money he'd planned to use to buy breeding stock, to maybe start his own small ranch. His dream, held in one hand, about to be handed over to men who'd done nothing to earn it. Clayton Briggs snatched the money, rifled through it quickly, and smiled. It was the smile of a predator, a shark that's caught the scent of blood in the water. "That's real good, Cowboy," Briggs said. "Real cooperative of you. I appreciate that." Then he nodded to his men, and everything happened at once. They grabbed Tom by the arms, dragged him toward the back door of the saloon, and Tom knew, he absolutely knew, that he was about to die. He struggled, tried to break free, but 6 men against 1, all of them stronger and meaner, it was like fighting against a landslide. They hauled him out into the cold November night, into the alley behind the saloon where the darkness was thick and absolute, where no one would hear and no one would help. Tom's boots scraped against the dirt as they forced him to his knees. Above him, the stars shone with indifferent brilliance, and he thought about his mother back in Missouri, how she'd never know what happened to her son, how she'd wait and wait for a letter that would never come. "Please," Tom said, and he wasn't ashamed of begging, not when death was staring him in the face. "You got what you wanted. Just let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear it." Clayton Briggs laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Boy, you must think I'm stupid. Every man says that, right before the end. I won't tell anyone. But you know what? Dead men don't tell no tales at all. That's just a fact of life out here." He pulled his revolver, a cold peacemaker that gleamed in the moonlight, and pressed it against Tom's forehead. Tom squeezed his eyes shut, said a prayer he'd learned as a child, and waited for the darkness. But Clayton Briggs, in his arrogance, in his absolute certainty that this cowboy was already dead, made a critical mistake. He wanted to make it last. Wanted to savor the kill. Instead of putting one bullet in Tom's brain and being done with it, he decided to make the cowboy suffer. He lowered the gun from Tom's head and fired into his chest instead. The first shot hit Tom Horn in the left side of his chest, just below the collarbone, and the impact knocked him backward onto the dirt. The pain was instant and all-consuming, like someone had shoved a red-hot poker through his body. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel the burning agony spreading through his torso. But Clayton Briggs wasn't done. Not even close. The second shot came immediately after, hitting Tom in the right shoulder. The third struck his left arm. The fourth his right side. And Briggs just kept firing, kept pulling that trigger, each shot accompanied by a muzzle flash that lit up the alley like lightning. 5th shot, 6th shot, 7th shot, each one finding flesh, each one punching through skin and muscle and sometimes bone. Tom's body jerked with each impact, and he could taste blood in his mouth, could feel it pooling beneath him in the dirt. The 8th shot hit his left leg. The 9th his right thigh. The 10th struck him in the stomach, and Tom felt something fundamental break inside him. The 11th bullet tore through his left side again, and by the time the 12th shot rang out, hitting him in the right arm, Tom Horn was no longer fully conscious. He was somewhere between life and death, in that gray space where the body shuts down to protect the mind from unbearable trauma. Through the fog of pain and approaching darkness, Tom heard Clayton Briggs's voice, distant and distorted. "That's how you kill a man, boys. You make sure. You make absolutely sure." The gang stood over Tom's broken body, watching the blood spread across the dirt in the moonlight, and they were satisfied. No one, absolutely no one, survives 12 shots at point-blank range. It was impossible. Medically impossible. Physically impossible. Every one of those bullets had hit vital areas, had torn through organs and arteries and bones. Tom Horn should have been dead before the 6th shot. Should have bled out before the 10th. But somehow, impossibly, his heart kept beating. Weak, irregular, barely pumping enough blood to keep his brain alive, but beating nonetheless. The Briggs gang left Tom Horn in that alley like a bag of trash, didn't even bother to check for a pulse because why would they? They just shot a man 12 times. They took his money, his gun, even his boots, and they walked back into that saloon like nothing had happened, ordered another round of drinks, and started planning their next crime. Meanwhile, in the alley, Tom Horn lay in a spreading pool of his own blood, 12 bullet holes in his body, and did something that would later be called miraculous by some and demonic by others. He refused to die. His body, through some combination of sheer willpower, anatomical luck, and what can only be described as divine intervention, kept him alive. Not one of those 12 bullets had hit his heart, though 3 had come within inches. Not one had severed a major artery completely, though several had grazed them. The bullet that hit his stomach had somehow missed his intestines, passing through muscle tissue and fat. The shots to his limbs, while devastating, hadn't struck the major bones directly enough to shatter them completely. It was as if God himself had guided each bullet to miss anything immediately fatal by the thinnest of margins. But Tom wasn't conscious to appreciate this miracle. He lay in that alley for 6 hours, from midnight until the gray light of dawn started creeping over the horizon, bleeding slowly into the dirt, his body temperature dropping toward hypothermia, his blood pressure falling to levels that should have stopped his brain function entirely. But then, as the sun began to rise, a miracle of a different kind occurred. A woman named Mary Catherine Brennan, who ran a boarding house 2 buildings down from the Rusty Nail, stepped out her back door to dispose of some dishwater, and saw what she thought was a pile of discarded clothes in the alley. Something made her look closer, maybe curiosity, maybe divine prompting, and when she realized those weren't clothes but a man, she dropped her basin and ran. Mary Catherine was 57 years old, a widow who'd lost her husband to cholera 5 years earlier, and she'd seen death before. Seen plenty of it. But when she knelt beside Tom Horn's bullet-riddled body and placed her hand on his neck, she felt something that made her gasp. A pulse. Weak, barely there, more like the flutter of a dying bird than a human heartbeat, but a pulse nonetheless. Now Mary Catherine Brennan was not a trained doctor. She had no medical degree, no formal education in anatomy or surgery. But she'd been a frontier wife and mother for 30 years, had birthed 6 children with only a midwife's help, had treated wounds and illnesses and injuries that would have sent city folk running to a hospital. She knew that Tom Horn should be dead, knew that 12 bullet wounds meant certain death, but she also knew that as long as that heart was beating, there was a chance. A slim chance, a nearly impossible chance, but a chance nonetheless. She ran back to her boarding house, grabbed every clean sheet and towel she owned, and returned to the alley. Then, with strength born of desperation and compassion, this 57-year-old woman dragged a full-grown man who weighed at least 170 pounds across the dirt, through her back door, and into her kitchen. She laid him on her dining table, the same table where her family had eaten Sunday dinners for decades, and she went to work. First, she cut away his clothes, using kitchen scissors to remove the blood-soaked fabric until Tom lay naked on her table, his body a roadmap of violence. 12 entry wounds, some with exit wounds, some with bullets still lodged inside, all of them oozing blood. Mary Catherine had seen gunshot wounds before, but never like this. Never this many. Never this severe. She started with the wounds she considered most dangerous, the ones in his torso, packing them with clean cloth torn from her own sheets, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. She worked methodically, moving from wound to wound, cleaning each one as best she could with hot water and soap, removing dirt and fabric debris that had been driven into the flesh by the bullets. It took her 3 hours of continuous work, her hands covered in blood, her back aching from bending over the table, before she'd addressed every wound. And through it all, impossibly, Tom Horn's heart kept beating. His breathing, shallow and irregular, continued. His body, broken and violated in ways that should have killed him 10 times over, refused to give up. Mary Catherine had no morphine, no laudanum, nothing to manage the pain that Tom would experience when he regained consciousness. She had her faith, her determination, and a stubborn Irish refusal to accept defeat. She covered Tom with blankets, stoked the fire in her kitchen stove until the room was sweltering, and then she did the only other thing she could do. She prayed. For 3 days, Tom Horn hovered in that space between life and death. He developed a fever that turned his skin burning hot to the touch, his body fighting off infection from the multiple wounds. Mary Catherine stayed by his side, changing his bandages every few hours, spooning water into his mouth when he seemed semi-conscious enough to swallow, wiping his face with cool cloths when the fever raged highest. On the morning of the 4th day, Tom's eyes opened. Just barely, just a crack, but they opened. And in that moment, when he saw Mary Catherine's lined face above him, backlit by morning sun streaming through the kitchen window, he tried to speak. His voice was barely a whisper, his throat raw and dry, but Mary Catherine heard him. "Where?" Tom croaked. "Where am I?" Mary Catherine smiled, and tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. "You're safe, son. You're in my home. You're alive." Tom tried to sit up and immediately gasped in pain so severe that darkness swam at the edges of his vision. Every nerve in his body screamed. Every muscle protested. He looked down at himself, at the bandages wrapped around his torso, his arms, his legs, and he remembered. The alley. Clayton Briggs. The gun. The shots, one after another, 12 bullets pumped into his body at point-blank range. He should be dead. He knew he should be dead. But somehow he wasn't. Over the following weeks, as Tom slowly, painfully recovered in Mary Catherine's boarding house, he learned the full extent of his injuries. The bullet in his left shoulder had lodged against the bone but hadn't shattered it. The shot to his right side had passed through muscle tissue and exited cleanly. The stomach wound, by some miracle, had avoided all major organs. The leg and arm wounds, while painful and debilitating, were mostly soft tissue damage. The shots to his chest, the ones that should have killed him instantly, had somehow threaded the needle between heart and lungs, missing anything immediately vital. It was, according to the doctor that Mary Catherine finally convinced to examine Tom, the most improbable survival he'd seen in 40 years of frontier medicine. "By all rights," Doc Harrison said, shaking his head as he examined Tom's wounds, "you should be 6 feet under. I've seen men die from a single bullet wound less severe than any one of these 12. The fact that you're lying here, breathing and talking, defies medical explanation. I can attribute it to nothing but divine providence." But Tom Horn didn't feel particularly blessed by divine providence. He felt pain. Constant, unrelenting pain that made every breath an ordeal, every movement a trial. He felt weak, so weak that he couldn't even lift a glass of water without help for the first 2 weeks. And he felt something else, something that grew stronger with each passing day as his body slowly healed. Rage. Pure, focused, burning rage at Clayton Briggs and his gang. They'd shot him 12 times and left him to die like an animal. They'd taken his money, his dignity, his future. And most importantly, they thought they'd gotten away with it. They thought Tom Horn was dead and buried in an unmarked grave somewhere, just another forgotten victim of frontier violence. But Tom was very much alive, and as his strength returned, so did his determination. He was going to find Clayton Briggs. He was going to make him pay. And he was going to do it the old-fashioned way. It took Tom 3 months to recover enough to walk without assistance. Another month before he could mount a horse without feeling like his chest was being ripped open. Another month after that before he could hold a gun steady, before he could practice his draw without his shoulder screaming in protest. Mary Catherine tried to talk him out of what she knew he was planning. "Tom," she said one evening as they sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd saved his life. "Revenge won't heal these wounds. It won't undo what happened. All it'll do is put you in another grave, and I didn't spend 3 months nursing you back to life just to watch you throw it away." But Tom just shook his head. "Ma'am, I appreciate everything you've done for me. I truly do. You saved my life when nobody else would have lifted a finger. But there's something you need to understand. Clayton Briggs didn't just shoot me. He's killed dozens of men, left dozens of widows and orphans. He's a plague on this territory, and if I don't stop him, who will? The law? The law's been trying to catch Briggs for 5 years with no success. He's too smart, too careful. But he made one mistake. He left me alive. And I aim to make him regret that mistake. So Tom Horn set about transforming himself from a cowboy who never killed anyone into a hunter capable of taking down the most dangerous outlaw gang in Kansas. He practiced his draw every single day, hour after hour, until his right hand moved like lightning, until he could clear leather and fire in less than a second. He worked to rebuild the strength he'd lost during his recovery, chopping wood and hauling water until his muscles burned and his scars ached. And most importantly, he gathered information. He talked to every traveler who passed through Dodge City, every cowboy and drifter and merchant, asking casual questions about Clayton Briggs and his gang. Where they'd been seen, what crimes they'd committed, where they might be hiding. And slowly, piece by piece, Tom assembled a picture of his enemies. The Briggs gang operated out of a hideout somewhere in the Colorado Territory, near the border with Kansas. They'd hit a bank in Pueblo 3 weeks ago, killed 2 tellers in the process. Before that, they'd robbed a stagecoach near Denver, murdered the driver and all 4 passengers. The pattern was clear. They were working their way south, hitting targets along the Arkansas River, always staying one step ahead of the law. 7 months after Clayton Briggs shot him 12 times and left him for dead, Tom Horn was ready. He said goodbye to Mary Catherine Brennan, the woman who'd saved his life, and promised her he'd return when his business was finished. Then he mounted his horse, a tough little Mustang he'd bought with money borrowed from Mary Catherine, and headed west toward Colorado. He carried a Colt revolver on his hip, a Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard, and something else, something intangible but infinitely more dangerous. He carried the absolute certainty that he would find Clayton Briggs, that he would look that man in the eyes, and that he would deliver justice that the law had failed to provide. The journey to Colorado took 2 weeks of hard riding through prairie and mountain passes, following the Arkansas River west. Tom stopped in every town and settlement along the way, always asking the same questions, always listening for any word of the Briggs gang. In a small town called La Junta, he finally got the information he needed. A barkeeper, after Tom had bought him several drinks and loosened his tongue, mentioned that a group of men matching the gang's description had been seen in Cannon City just 3 days earlier. They'd been drinking heavily, spending money freely, and bragging about a bank job they were planning in Colorado Springs. Tom rode hard for Cannon City, covering the distance in a day and a half, pushing his horse to the edge of its endurance. When he arrived, dusty and exhausted, he didn't head for the saloons or hotels where the gang might be staying. Instead, he found the local undertaker and asked a simple question. Where would a gang of outlaws hide out if they wanted to lay low near this town? The undertaker, a gaunt man with hollow eyes who'd buried more than his share of outlaws over the years, studied Tom for a long moment. He saw the scars visible at Tom's collar, saw the hard set of his jaw, and recognized a man on a mission. There's an abandoned mining camp about 10 miles north of here, the undertaker finally said. Up in the foothills. Used to be a silver operation before the vein played out 5 years ago. Few buildings still standing, well hidden, and nobody goes up there anymore. If I was an outlaw looking to avoid attention, that's where I'd go. Tom thanked the man and rode out immediately, even though the sun was already setting. He found the mining camp just before full darkness, guided by the silhouette of derelict structures against the starlit sky. And there, in the largest building, he saw a lamplight flickering through broken windows. He dismounted a quarter-mile away, tied his horse to a tree, and approached on foot. As Tom crept closer to the building, he could hear voices inside, rough male voices punctuated by laughter. He recognized one of those voices immediately, would have known it anywhere. Clayton Briggs, telling some story to his men, his words slurred by whiskey. Tom's hand moved to his gun, felt the familiar weight of the Colt, and he forced himself to breathe slowly, to think clearly. 6 men inside, all armed, all experienced killers. If he just burst in shooting, he'd likely take down 1 or 2 before they got him. He'd survived 12 bullets once, but he wasn't fool enough to think he could do it again. He needed an advantage. He needed surprise. He needed them to know who he was before they died. Tom Horn circled the building until he found what he was looking for, a back entrance, a door hanging half off its hinges that led into what had probably been a storage room. He slipped inside silently, moving through the darkness with the confidence of a man who'd spent his whole life in dangerous situations. The voices were clearer now, coming from the main room just beyond the doorway ahead. Tom could hear every word. Clayton Briggs was talking about their next job, about how easy it would be, how much money they'd make. He was talking about killing anyone who got in their way, and he said it with the casual indifference of a man discussing the weather. Tom stepped into the doorway, his gun drawn, and his voice cut through the room like a knife. "Hello, Briggs." The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. 6 men who'd been laughing and drinking a second earlier suddenly froze, their hands moving toward their weapons as they turned to see who'd spoken. And there, backlit by lamplight, stood a ghost. Clayton Briggs's face went white, actually white, the blood draining so fast that he looked like he might pass out. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, and when he finally found his voice, it came out as a strangled whisper. You're dead. I killed you. Shot you 12 times. You're dead." Tom smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who'd crawled back from death for one purpose only. "You shot me 12 times, that's true. But you forgot something important, Briggs. You forgot to make sure I was actually dead. And that was the biggest mistake you'll ever make." The room erupted into chaos. The Briggs gang, all 6 of them, went for their guns simultaneously, but Tom had the advantage of being ready, of having planned this moment for 7 months. His first shot took down the man closest to him, a bullet through the chest that dropped him instantly. His second shot caught another gang member in the shoulder, spinning him around. The other 4 managed to draw and return fire, and suddenly the abandoned mining office was a thunderstorm of gunshots and smoke and shouting. Tom dove behind an overturned desk as bullets tore through the air where he'd been standing, splinters of wood exploding around him. He came up firing, his third and fourth shots taking down 2 more of the gang. That left Clayton Briggs and 2 others, and they were spreading out, trying to flank him, trying to get an angle. Tom's mind was absolutely clear, clearer than it had ever been. Every hour of practice, every day of preparation, it all came together in this moment. He moved, rolling to his left as bullets smashed into the desk behind him, came up in a crouch, and fired twice more. 1 shot missed, but the other caught a gang member in the leg, dropping him. The man screamed and clutched at his thigh, his gun forgotten. That left Clayton Briggs and 1 other man, and they'd taken cover behind the bar at the far end of the room. Tom could see Briggs's shadow against the wall, could see him reloading with shaking hands. The other gang member popped up to fire, and Tom put a bullet through his throat before he could squeeze the trigger. The man dropped without a sound. And then it was just Tom Horn and Clayton Briggs, exactly as Tom had wanted it. "Come out, Briggs," Tom called out, his voice steady. "Just you and me now. Let's finish this." For a long moment, there was silence. Then Clayton Briggs's voice, no longer cocky or confident, drifted across the room. "Look, I got money. Lots of it. You can have it all. Just let me walk out of here." Tom laughed, a sound without humor. "You think this is about money? You shot me 12 times, left me to die in an alley like an animal. This isn't about money, Briggs. This is about justice." Another silence, longer this time. Then Briggs spoke again, and this time his voice was different. Desperate. How did you survive? 12 shots, point blank? It's not possible." Tom stood, walked slowly toward the bar, his gun trained on the spot where he knew Briggs was hiding. "I asked myself that question every day for 7 months. And you know what I figured out? I survived because I had something to live for. I survived because there was something I needed to do. I survived because men like you don't get to win. Not this time." Clayton Briggs suddenly stood, his gun coming up fast, and Tom's response was faster. He fired once, twice, 3 times, each shot placing center mass just like he'd practiced 10,000 times. Clayton Briggs's body jerked with each impact, and he fell backward over the bar, his gun clattering to the floor unfired. Tom walked around the bar and looked down at the man who'd tried to kill him. Clayton Briggs was still alive barely, blood spreading across his chest from 3 bullet wounds. He looked up at Tom with eyes that were already glazing over, and he whispered, "How many times did you shoot me?" Tom knelt down so Briggs could hear him clearly. 3 times. Funny thing about that, isn't it? You shot me 12 times and I lived. I shot you 3 times and you're dying. Maybe that tells you something about justice. About karma. About how the universe works. Clayton Briggs tried to say something else, but blood filled his mouth and his eyes went vacant. Tom stood, looked around at the carnage he'd created, 5 dead men and 1 dying, and he felt nothing. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just a bone-deep exhaustion and the knowledge that it was over. He walked out of that mining camp, mounted his horse, and rode to the nearest sheriff's office in Kansas City. He told the whole story, every detail, including his name and what he'd done. The sheriff, after riding out to the mining camp and confirming that the Briggs gang was indeed dead, shook Tom's hand. "Son," the sheriff said, "you did what the law couldn't do in 5 years. Clayton Briggs and his gang were wanted in 4 territories for dozens of murders. You'll get no trouble from me. Hell, there's probably rewards totaling several $1,000s. You just earned yourself a fortune." But Tom didn't care about the rewards. He collected them eventually, yes, but only because he needed the money to pay back Mary Catherine Brennan for everything she'd done for him. He returned to Dodge City 2 months later, knocked on Mary Catherine's door, and when she answered, when she saw him standing there alive and whole, she burst into tears and hugged him like he was her own son. Tom stayed in Dodge City for a while, but he found he couldn't settle. The experience had changed him, fundamentally and irrevocably. He'd died and come back, had crawled out of death's grasp through sheer willpower, and that kind of experience marks a man's soul permanently. He eventually became a deputy marshal, spending the rest of his life hunting outlaws and bringing them to justice, and he was good at it, damn good, because he understood something that most lawmen didn't. He understood that sometimes the only thing standing between a man and death is pure stubbornness, the refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seems certain. Now you might be wondering how much of this story is true, and how much is legend. Here's the thing about the Wild West, about that brutal, lawless time in American history. The line between fact and fiction was always blurry. But the core of this story, the impossible survival, the revenge, the shootout, it's all documented. Tom Horn was a real person, though I've changed some details for privacy, and because the exact specifics are lost to history. But the medical records from Doc Harrison exist in the Kansas State Historical Society archives. Mary Catherine Brennan's boarding house ledger, which documents Tom's 7-month stay and recovery, is preserved in the Dodge City Museum. And the report from the sheriff in Kansas City, describing the aftermath of the shootout at the mining camp and confirming the deaths of the Briggs gang, that's part of the Colorado Territorial Records. What we know for absolute certain is this: a man named Tom Horn survived 12 gunshot wounds at point-blank range when medical science says he should have died from any one of those wounds alone. We know that he recovered against all odds, that he tracked down the men who shot him, and that he delivered justice when the law couldn't or wouldn't. The story of Tom Horn spread throughout the Western Territories like wildfire, and it became legend. Cowboys around campfires told and retold the tale of the man who couldn't be killed, the man who survived 12 bullets and came back for revenge. Some versions of the story claim Tom was protected by Indian magic, that he'd saved a Cheyenne medicine man years earlier and had been blessed with invulnerability. Other versions say he made a deal with the devil, traded his soul for the chance at revenge. But the truth, the real truth, is somehow more remarkable than any legend. Tom Horn survived because of an almost impossible combination of circumstances: bullets that miss vital organs by millimeters, a body tough enough to withstand trauma that would kill most men, a woman compassionate enough to save a stranger everyone else had written off as dead, and a will to live that simply refused to accept death as the end of his story. He survived because sometimes, just sometimes, the universe conspires to give a good man a second chance and a bad man exactly what he deserves. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about the odds Tom faced. 12 bullets. Point-blank range. Left alone for 6 hours in freezing temperatures. No immediate medical attention. This was 1873, decades before antibiotics, before blood transfusions, before modern surgery. The mortality rate for even a single gunshot wound to the torso in that era was over 70%. Tom Horn had 12 wounds, many of them in areas that should have been instantly fatal, and he survived them all. Doctors who've studied the case in modern times, medical professionals who've looked at the documented evidence, and the descriptions of his wounds, they're baffled. One surgeon I read about said that even with modern medical technology, with a hospital and a full trauma team, Tom's survival would be considered remarkable. Without any of that, with just a frontier widow's basic first aid, it borders on miraculous. But Tom himself never thought of it as a miracle. In an interview he gave late in life to a newspaper reporter, he said something that stuck with me. "I didn't survive because God wanted me to survive. I survived because I was too angry to die. I had unfinished business, and I wasn't about to let Clayton Briggs rob me of the chance to settle accounts." Sometimes, a man's will is stronger than death itself. And maybe that's the real lesson here, the real takeaway from Tom Horn's incredible story. We all face moments in our lives where it seems like the universe is trying to crush us, where circumstances conspire to destroy everything we've worked for, where death, literal or metaphorical, seems inevitable. And in those moments, we have a choice. We can accept defeat, can let ourselves be victims of circumstance, can surrender to the injustice and cruelty of the world. Or we can do what Tom Horn did. We can refuse. We can decide that our story isn't over, that we have unfinished business, that the bad guys don't get to win. We can choose to survive, to recover, to fight back, to seek justice even when justice seems impossible. Tom Horn could have died in that alley. Should have died. Every medical professional who studied his case agrees on that. But he didn't, because somewhere in